Recently, a question has sparked intense debate on the Chinese internet. Why has there been almost no serious response to the Netherlands moving to seize Chinese corporate assets through the Nexperia case, while Japan's current Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, is firing off fierce public criticism? This question has drawn widespread attention and agreement. The argument begins by saying that now is the time to prepare in advance. In this view, China must support Russia more firmly, pushing it toward fully dismantling Ukraine and thereby weakening the European Union. It is argued that the European Union no longer has value for political outreach or persuasion, and it is impossible to win it over again. When the time comes to resolve the Taiwan issue, the EU will, in this perspective, definitely jump out, just as it is acting now toward Russia, imposing extreme sanctions and enforcing a hard decoupling on China. Even if Russia wins the war, the argument goes, it cannot win Europe. Their relationship will only become more deeply fractured. There is no realistic chance of Russia and Europe forming a joint front to contain China. At most, Russia would sell goods to Europe at high prices and seize opportunities to demand the lifting of sanctions and the granting of new benefits, playing this diplomacy even more skillfully than India. But it is believed that Russia will never shift its strategic focus from Europe to the Far East. For this reason, the argument insists that China must act early, neutralizing the threats that are bound to emerge. To do so, China must now strengthen its real and effective support for Russia. First, it recalls that China once placed great hopes in the EU, especially in Germany and France. China had hoped that Europe could become one of several major world powers and help build a stable global order. But the world has changed much faster than expected. From this point of view, the EU, Germany and France included, has entered decline across its economy, technology, culture, and governance capacity. It cannot withstand Russia's military pressure, nor can it withstand former President Trump's tariff threats. It is argued that Europe can no longer be lifted back up. It lacks strength, capability, and especially strategic independence, and thus cannot function as a true pole in the global system. As the United States begins its own decline, the significance of this once hoped-for European pole, it is said, becomes even smaller. Second, it is argued that the EU now openly treats China as a hostile state. Europe is described as filled with a deep, barely concealed hostility toward China and determined to decouple. If they are not preparing for confrontation, this argument asks, why would they need to sever economic ties so abruptly? Several EU countries are compared to a pack of hyenas circling around Chinese-invested companies, constantly calculating how to seize Chinese assets just as they seized the property of Russian entrepreneurs. The Dutch action against Nexperia is only the first example. If the Netherlands succeeds, many fear that other EU member states will rush forward together, launching a wave of seizures targeting Chinese firms. From this perspective, the EU is no longer worth nor capable of political outreach. Third, the argument turns to a historical analogy reframed for Western listeners. 5 years ago, the EU resembled a once influential regional power bloc, still worth negotiating with because more urgent strategic opponents demanded priority. Today's EU, however, appears more like a weakened faction on the losing side of a prolonged political contest, still resisting but making demands far beyond its real leverage. In this view, this is the posture Europe now takes toward China. Fourth, it is argued that the moment has come to decisively weaken what is called the reactionary bloc within the EU. Europe faces deep-rooted economic, social, and political problems. Russia's military pressure remains immense. and Trump's tariffs have shaken Europe's confidence and damaged its growth. If the Democrats return to power in 3 years, some believe the EU may regain stability. But in Trump's eyes, this argument claims the EU represents the European wing of the Democratic Party. With timely cooperation from China, Trump could squeeze more concessions from Europe and further weaken it. What Trump is weakening is not only Europe's economy, but also the EU's legitimacy as a unified political structure. If such a structure cannot protect the interests of its members, what purpose does it serve? It is believed that this window of opportunity may last only about 2 years. Fifth, it is argued that there is no need to fear that a victorious Russia would go on to dominate Europe or merge politically with it. Even if Russia dismantles Ukraine, what it will gain, this view holds, is unending hostility from the EU. In the eyes of Europeans, Russia's image would be no better than that of American soldiers in Iraq, and perhaps as poor as the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. Europeans fundamentally look down on Russia and consider themselves ahead in economics, technology, culture, and political development. Therefore, even if a military occupation were to occur, Europe would never truly unite with Russia. Sixth, the argument notes that Europe's overall strength remains far greater than Russia's. To create a long-term balance in which neither side can dominate, Europe must be weakened. Only then, even if Europe and Russia were to cooperate, they would form nothing more than a fractured, turbulent collection of declining states. Such a bloc would not strengthen Russia, nor would it unify Europe. It is argued that Russia will not transform from an energy supplier into a manufacturing powerhouse. European manufacturing will continue relocating toward North America and East Asia. If the EU wins the conflict in Ukraine, there may still be a path to continental integration. But if Russia wins, Europe will never agree to integrate with Russia. For this reason, weakening Europe is seen as essential. Seventh, it is argued that if Russia dismantles Ukraine, the resulting grievances will bind Russia and the EU into a permanent confrontation. This confrontation would form a new Iron Curtain stretching from Moscow to Brussels. At the same time, it would create internal divisions within the EU between states that participate in the partition of Ukraine and those that refuse. Eighth, the argument then addresses practical support for Russia. Many private companies in Central Asia are said to be willing to assist in maintaining what they call free international trade. As long as certain officials in China are somewhat less strict when reviewing export lists, as long as manufacturers, perhaps operating under alternate names, provide technical guidance, effective support can be delivered quietly. Ninth, from a longer-term perspective, the argument holds that no matter how harshly the United States treats the EU or how gently China treats it, Europe will intervene when China addresses the Taiwan issue, just as it is intervening against Russia today. Since this is inevitable, the argument concludes, it is better to weaken Europe in advance. China must help Trump reduce Europe's strength so that Europe cannot act as an independent pole and coordinate with Japan and South Korea at that critical moment. 10th, it is argued that there is no need to worry that instability in Europe or Russia will damage China's export markets. When Europe's manufacturing capacity finally collapses, its products will lose competitiveness outside the continent. China will take over that global market share. What China gains elsewhere, according to this view, will outweigh what it loses in Europe and will be more durable. Through this lens, the debate concludes that while nationalist rhetoric at home may be loud, and while Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi speaks assertively, the real task is not to shout, but to act. China must decisively increase meaningful support for Russia and seize this limited strategic window to weaken the EU before it becomes a future obstacle.